Alien Queen's crew pleaded for assistance. Humans responded with the planet's mightiest, the Xylian race. An ancient and once powerful civilization was facing its darkest hour. For centuries, they had been the rulers of their star system, their technology unrivaled by any other species. But now, their homeworld was dying, and they had no choice but to send out a plea to the far reaches of the galaxy, hoping for a miracle. Queen Zareth, the wise and respected leader of the Xylians, knew that time was running out. The destruction of her people wasn't just an inevitable event, it was happening right before her eyes. The crisis had begun months earlier when a strange, unknown force appeared in their star system. A dark, powerful alien race known as the Z-Corps had invaded the Xylian homeworld. The Z-Corps' technology was advanced, their weapons beyond anything the Xylians had ever encountered. The invaders unleashed a series of devastating attacks that crippled the planet's defenses. They destroyed cities, crippled their space fleets, and laid waste to the Xylian cities with a terrifying efficiency. What was even more frightening was the Z-Corps' ultimate weapon, a black hole generator that threatened to destroy everything in its path. It was capable of tearing apart entire planets. With the Z-Corps at their doorsteps and their once mighty planet crumbling, Queen Zareth had no choice but to turn to the stars for help. The Xylian queen had already tried everything she could. Her people had fought valiantly, pushing the invaders back for as long as they could, but each attempt had been met with failure. The Xylians were brave, but they were not strong enough to match the might of the Z-Corps. In her desperation, Queen Zareth turned to an unlikely source: humanity. Earth, a planet they had only recently discovered through long-range probes, had begun to make waves in the galaxy. The Xylians had observed Earth's rapid technological advancement and their resilience. They had seen how humans overcame their own challenges, how they had risen from the ashes of war, poverty, and violence to become a growing force on the galactic stage. And so, Queen Zareth made the decision to send a message across the stars. She had no guarantees that humans would respond, but she had to try. The transmission was a simple plea asking for help. It wasn't just a request for military aid, it was a cry for survival. The message was sent on all frequencies, reaching every corner of Earth. The Xylians needed assistance, and they needed it fast. On Earth, the message was received with a mix of confusion and intrigue. No one had expected to hear from an alien civilization, let alone one that was so desperate. At first, most governments dismissed the transmission as a hoax or some form of alien trickery. But as scientists and military leaders began to examine the message, it became clear that it was genuine. The Xylians, though unknown to most of the human population, were in grave danger. The humans had always known that the galaxy was vast and full of unknowns, but they had never expected to be contacted by an alien species in need. World leaders gathered for an emergency meeting. The question was raised: should Earth intervene? The decision wasn't easy. The idea of going to war with an unknown alien force was terrifying. The Z-Corps were ruthless, and their power seemed almost unlimited. Some argued that the humans should stay out of it. After all, it wasn't their fight. Others, however, felt a sense of responsibility. Humanity had come a long way, and now they had a chance to prove their worth in the galaxy. They could not, in good conscience, turn their back on an entire species in need. At the United Nations, representatives from the major powers met in secret to discuss the situation. The debate raged on for hours. Some feared the Z-Corps would turn their attention to Earth if they intervened, while others argued that the fate of the Xylian race could not be ignored. After much discussion, a resolution was passed. Humanity would send aid to the Xylians. It was not a decision made lightly, but it was the right one. The United Nations quickly assembled a coalition of nations, combining their military forces, technological expertise, and resources. The world's most advanced space fleet was quickly put together, led by the Defender of Earth, a new class of warship designed to carry humanity's might into the stars. The Defender was a massive vessel, equipped with the latest in human technology, from advanced shields to long-range weaponry. It was built with one purpose in mind: to fight the Z-Corps and protect the Xylians. As the humans prepared for their mission, the world's eyes were on them. News outlets covered the development of the space fleet, and the public was both excited and fearful. People didn't know what to expect, But they all knew that this was the moment that humanity had been waiting for, a chance to make their mark on the galaxy. The world's best engineers, scientists, and soldiers were brought together to prepare for the mission. The humans had the technology, the determination, and the will to fight. But what they lacked was experience in dealing with such a powerful enemy. In the days leading up to the mission, the crew of the Defender of Earth underwent intensive training. Military personnel from all over the world were selected to be part of the mission, and they quickly became a tight-knit team. Soldiers, tacticians, engineers, and pilots worked together, learning how to operate the massive warship and prepare for what lay ahead. Despite the heavy odds against them, there was a sense of unity and purpose among the crew. They weren't just fighting for their planet, they were fighting for the survival of an entire alien race. The mission was set to launch at the crack of dawn. As the crew gathered aboard the Defender, the excitement and fear were palpable. The ship's engines roared to life, and for the first time in history, humanity's greatest warriors were heading into space. The journey to the Xylian homeworld would take several weeks, and during that time, the crew would prepare themselves for the battles that lay ahead. They would need to learn not just how to fight, but how to adapt to an entirely new set of challenges. As the fleet traveled through the vastness of space, the crew faced their first major test. The Z-Corps had already begun to take notice of the human response. They were not going to sit idly by while humanity made its way to the Xylian system. The first signs of the Z-Corps fleet appeared on the radar. It was clear that the battle for the Xylian homeworld was going to be a brutal one, but the humans were ready. They had no choice but to be. They were now the last hope for an entire civilization, and they would not back down. The final stretch of the journey was tense. The crew aboard the Defender knew that the moment they arrived in the Xylian system, they would be thrust into a battle for survival. The fate of both humanity and the Xylians rested on their shoulders. As they neared the Xylian homeworld, the Z-Corps' ships loomed in the distance, huge, menacing, and unstoppable. The humans could only hope that they were prepared for what lay ahead. Queen Zareth had done everything she could. She had sent out the plea, and now it was up to humanity to answer. Would they be able to save her people from the Z-Corps, or would the Xylians fall to the invaders, lost forever to the stars? As the humans prepared for their arrival, they couldn't help but wonder, was this the moment that would define their place in the galaxy, or would they be overwhelmed by the power of the Z-Corps? Only time would tell, and the fate of two species hung in the balance. The Defender of Earth sliced through the void of space, its engines humming softly as it traveled toward the distant Xylian homeworld. Aboard the ship, the atmosphere was tense. The crew of soldiers, engineers, scientists, and tacticians from all over the world worked diligently to prepare for what lay ahead. They knew the stakes. They weren't just fighting for their own planet's survival. They were fighting to save an alien race that had reached out for help. A race that had once been a powerful force in the galaxy, now reduced to pleading for aid. The journey had taken weeks, and in that time the crew had grown closer. There was no room for doubt, no time for fear. The Defender had been built for this mission, and the crew was its beating heart. The soldiers trained with the latest weapons, learning how to operate in zero gravity and deal with the unpredictable conditions of space. The engineers fine-tuned the ship systems, ensuring that every component was ready for the impending battle. The scientists and tacticians worked around the clock, analyzing every piece of intelligence they had gathered about the Z-Corps. But despite their preparation, there was a sense of unease that lingered in the air. The Z-Corps were a force unlike any the humans had ever faced. Their technology was beyond comprehension, their weapons capable of destroying entire fleets in an instant. The Defender of Earth was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. The humans knew they had to rely on more than just firepower. They had to rely on their ingenuity, their ability to adapt, and most importantly, their unity. As the days passed, the crew spent time communicating with the Xylians, learning about their culture, their history, and the devastation they had suffered. Queen Zareth, though a regal and calm leader, spoke with a quiet desperation in her voice. She explained that the Z-Corps were not just invaders, they were a plague. The Z-Corps had decimated planet after planet, taking over civilizations with brutal efficiency. The Xylians were the last of the peaceful races in the galaxy, and now they were fighting for their very existence. They were a dying people, but they weren't ready to give up without a fight. They just needed help. The humans, moved by the Xylians' plight, understood the gravity of the situation. But there was one question that lingered in everyone's mind. Would they be able to stop the Z-Corps in time? The Defender was a formidable ship, but its crew was inexperienced in dealing with such a powerful enemy. The Z-Corps had already proven their might by destroying entire fleets and annihilating Xylian cities. Would Earth's best be enough to stop them? The answer came sooner than expected. As the Defender entered the Xylian system, the crew noticed a strange shift in the atmosphere. The calm of space was suddenly broken by the appearance of a large fleet of Z-Corps warships. They were massive, dark, and menacing, their sleek designs a stark contrast to the more humble human ships. The Z-Corps ships glowed with a cold, otherworldly light, and the hum of their engines echoed across the communication systems. The Z-Corps fleet had been waiting for them. The moment the Z-Corps ships appeared, the crew of the Defender went into action. The tactical officers scrambled to assess the situation, analyzing the enemy's position and weaponry. The soldiers prepared for the worst, knowing that a battle was imminent. The engineers worked frantically, making sure the ship's weapon systems were fully charged and ready to engage. Captain Ramirez, the commander of the Defender, stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the enemy fleet. He was a seasoned leader, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. "Prepare for battle," he ordered, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We've trained for this. We will not let Earth fall, and we will not let the Xylians fall." The crew responded with a unified chorus of "Yes, Captain," and got to work, each person knowing their role and executing it with precision. The Defender's engines roared to life as it maneuvered into position, and the ship's massive weapons array began charging. The tension was palpable as everyone on board braced for the fight of their lives. In the distance, the Z-Corps fleet moved into position, their ships forming a perfect formation. It was clear they had been waiting for this moment. The Z-Corps' strategy was clear. They intended to annihilate the Defender before it could even launch an attack. But the humans weren't going down without a fight. The first volley of fire came from the Z-Corps ships, massive energy blasts that tore through space, closing in on the Defender with incredible speed. The crew braced for impact, but Captain Ramirez held firm, refusing to back down. "Return fire," he ordered. The Defender's weapon systems fired back with a tremendous roar, energy blasts streaking toward the Z-Corps fleet. The two sides collided in a dazzling display of light and sound, with explosions rippling through space as each ship unleashed its fury. The Defender's shields held strong, absorbing the initial wave of attacks, but the crew could feel the strain as the Z-Corps' weaponry battered the ship. Despite their best efforts, the Z-Corps fleet was far superior in numbers and firepower. It wasn't long before the humans realized they were outmatched. The Defender's shields began to falter, and the ship rocked violently with each successive hit. The Z-Corps' ships closed in, their weapons firing relentlessly, tearing through the Defender's outer hull. Captain Ramirez gritted his teeth, watching the damage unfold. "Get us out of here, full speed ahead," he shouted. The Defender lurched forward, its engines firing at full power, narrowly avoiding another deadly blast. The Z-Corps fleet continued its relentless pursuit, and it became clear that the Defender wouldn't survive much longer unless they could come up with a new plan. As the Defender made a desperate attempt to retreat, the Xylian resistance fleet arrived. The Xylian ships, though smaller and less advanced, were fierce warriors in their own right. They came at the Z-Corps with everything they had, firing everything from laser blasts to energy projectiles. It wasn't enough to turn the tide of battle, but it bought the Defender precious time to regroup. Captain Ramirez's mind raced as he quickly formulated a new plan. The Xylians had been valuable allies, but they were far too weak to engage the Z-Corps head-on. They needed something else. They needed to find the weakness in the Z-Corps' strategy, something that would give them the upper hand. As the Defender pulled back to the edge of the battle, Ramirez knew they couldn't afford to wait for a miracle. They needed to strike back, and they needed to do it now. "Lieutenant, activate the ion cannon," he ordered. The ion cannon was a weapon that had never been fully tested in battle, a last-ditch effort to give the humans an advantage. The ion cannon had the potential to disrupt the Z-Corps' energy systems, giving the humans a fighting chance. Lieutenant Turner, the ship's weapons officer, nodded. "Aye, Captain, charging the ion cannon now." The hum of the weapon charging filled the ship as the crew waited in anticipation. The battle raged on, with the Defender and Xylian ships dodging and weaving around Z-Corps fire. Finally, the ion cannon was ready. "Fire!" Captain Ramirez shouted. The energy blast shot forward, striking the lead Z-Corps ship with a blinding flash of light. The ship's systems sputtered and failed, and the Z-Corps vessel began to spiral out of control. It exploded in a massive fireball, taking several Z-Corps ships with it. The humans and Xylians cheered, but the battle was far from over. The Z-Corps fleet was formidable, and their retaliation was swift. The Defender continued to engage, but it was clear that the outcome of this battle was uncertain. As the Defender and its allies fought for their lives, Ramirez could only hope that the humans' determination and resourcefulness would be enough to turn the tide. The Z-Corps were ruthless, but humanity had something the invaders couldn't understand: the will to survive. The battle had raged for hours, and the situation was growing more desperate by the minute. Captain Ramirez stood at the helm of the Defender of Earth, his knuckles white from gripping the console. The Z-Corps fleet was vast, their ships massive and formidable. The humans had managed to take down one or two of the invaders, but it felt like a drop in the ocean. The Z-Corps had endless ships and advanced weapons that seemed to have no equal. As the Defender rocked under another direct hit, Ramirez felt the weight of the responsibility pressing on him. "Captain, our shields are at 35%, Lieutenant Turner called out from her station. "We can't keep taking hits like this. We need to find a way to disable their weapons." Ramirez nodded grimly. They were running out of options. The Defender had been built to withstand a heavy barrage of attacks, but even it had its limits. And the Z-Corps had already shown that they had far more firepower than the humans could handle. Yet they couldn't give up. The Xylians were depending on them. Earth was depending on them. They had to fight. They had to win. "We need to move fast," Ramirez said. "Lieutenant, can you isolate their weapon systems? Maybe there's a way we can disrupt them." Turner typed rapidly on her console, her fingers dancing over the keys. "I can try, but it's going to be difficult. They're using advanced shielding technology. It's unlike anything we've seen before." "Do it anyway," Ramirez ordered. "We're running out of time." Meanwhile, on the Xylian resistance ships, the battle continued to rage. Their fleet was holding its ground, but barely. The Z-Corps were overwhelming them, forcing the Xylians to retreat to the far side of their homeworld. Queen Zareth, aboard the flagship, watched the destruction unfold from her command center. She could feel the weight of her people's history on her shoulders. They had been one of the most powerful races in the galaxy, but now they were fighting for survival. The Xylians had sent out their plea to humanity, and it had been answered. But even with Earth's mighty ships in the fight, it seemed like the odds were still against them. Queen Zareth clenched her fists, her heart heavy. She had hoped the humans would be the turning point, the force that would drive the Z-Corps back. But so far, all they had done was hold the line. The Z-Corps were relentless, and their fleet seemed endless. "Your Majesty," an officer called out, breaking her concentration. "The humans are engaging the Z-Corps head-on. Their ships are holding, but we need to provide additional support. Our forces are stretched thin." Zareth nodded, her expression hardening. "Send word to the resistance fleet. We cannot afford to lose ground now. Reinforce the Defender of Earth. We will fight until the last." On the bridge of the Defender, Lieutenant Turner's voice broke through the tension. "Captain, I've found something. The Z-Corps' weapon systems have a weak point, a vulnerability in their energy grid. If we can hit it, we might be able to disable their main weapons." Ramirez's eyes widened. "How do we hit it?" "It's a small target and we'll have to get close," Turner replied, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But I think it's possible. We need to move fast, though. The Z-Corps will adjust their tactics once they realize we're onto them." "Prepare the ion cannon," Ramirez said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll take the risk, but we can't waste any more time." The crew scrambled into action as the Defender adjusted its course. They would have to get close to the Z-Corps flagship, risking the heavy fire from the rest of their fleet. The ship shuddered as another blast hit the shields, but the Defender pressed on. Every second counted. The target was just ahead. "Ready, Captain," Turner called out. "The ion cannon is locked onto their energy grid. We're in range." "Fire," Ramirez ordered. The ion cannon discharged with a deafening roar, sending a burst of energy through space toward the Z-Corps flagship. It was a precise shot, aimed at the weak point Turner had identified. The blast struck with incredible force, and for a moment the Z-Corps ship flickered. Its weapons ceased firing and its shields dropped. The humans had done it. They had found the vulnerability and struck at the heart of the enemy's power, but the victory was short-lived. The Z-Corps fleet wasn't finished yet. The flagship's weapons systems might have been temporarily disabled, but the rest of the fleet was still attacking with full force. The Defender and the remaining Xylian ships were outnumbered, and the Z-Corps were beginning to adjust their tactics. They moved in tighter formations, using their sheer numbers to overwhelm the human and Xylian forces. "Captain, they're closing in," Lieutenant Turner said urgently. "We need to fall back. We can't keep up with their numbers." "We can't fall back now," Ramirez replied, his voice unwavering. "We've made a dent in their fleet, but it's not enough. We need to keep fighting to give the Xylians the time they need to regroup. We've got to hold them off until help arrives." The crew worked tirelessly, trying to fend off the Z-Corps' relentless assault. The Defender's cannons fired continuously, blasting through the Z-Corps' shields, but the sheer size and power of the Z-Corps fleet were beginning to take their toll. The Defender was battered, its hull damaged from the constant barrage. The shields flickered dangerously, and the ship groaned under the stress. On the Xylian resistance ships, the situation was even worse. The Z-Corps had already destroyed several of their smaller vessels, and the remaining ships were fighting for survival. Queen Zareth had watched the battle from her command center, her heart sinking with each passing minute. They were running out of options. The humans had bought them time, but the Z-Corps were too strong. Her people were dying, and she couldn't save them all. "Your Majesty, we must retreat," one of her advisors suggested. "We cannot sustain this battle much longer." Zareth stood in silence for a moment, her eyes fixed on the chaos outside. It was true. Her people had fought valiantly, but they were outmatched. The Z-Corps would not stop until they had wiped them out completely, and yet something inside her refused to give up. "We will not retreat," Zareth said, her voice filled with resolve. "The humans have given us a chance. We will not waste it. We fight on until the very last." The Xylian fleet, though small and weakened, continued to press forward. They fought with everything they had, refusing to back down. The humans, too, kept up the fight, their ships and soldiers enduring the endless assault. The battle had become a war of attrition, each side losing ground, each side struggling to hold on. As the hours wore on, the Z-Corps' numbers began to dwindle. The ion cannon had done its work, and the humans' relentless attacks had begun to have an effect. The Z-Corps ships, though still powerful, were starting to weaken. The Xylians, driven by the hope that the humans had given them, fought back with newfound strength. It was then that the unexpected happened. Reinforcements arrived. A fleet of human warships, the largest ever assembled, appeared out of nowhere, flanking the Z-Corps from behind. The Z-Corps had been so focused on the Defender and the Xylians that they had failed to notice the backup. The new fleet, along with the Defender and the Xylians, pressed the attack. The Z-Corps were caught off guard, their formation breaking apart as the new human fleet unleashed a devastating assault. The Z-Corps flagship, still damaged from the ion cannon strike, was targeted by a new round of fire, and within moments it was destroyed. The rest of the Z-Corps fleet, now leaderless and in disarray, began to retreat. The battle was won. The humans and Xylians had fought side by side, and together they had pushed back the Z-Corps. The victory wasn't without its cost. Many ships had been lost, and countless lives had been sacrificed, but the Z-Corps had been defeated. Queen Zareth stood at the helm of her flagship, watching the retreating Z-Corps ships as they fled into the depths of space. "Thank you, humans," she whispered softly. "You have saved us." Captain Ramirez stood on the bridge of the Defender, watching the Xylian fleet begin to regroup. The humans had done it. They had faced the impossible and won. Earth's might, combined with the courage and strength of the Xylians, had triumphed over the Z-Corps. The victory was hard-earned, but it was theirs. The Z-Corps had been driven back, and the Xylians had been saved, at least for the moment. As the remaining Z-Corps ships retreated into the vastness of space, the battle-scarred Defender of Earth and the small fleet of Xylian warships began their slow retreat. The damage to their ships was significant, but they had survived, and with their survival came a hard-won hope. Captain Ramirez stood at the helm of the Defender, looking out at the wreckage of the Z-Corps fleet drifting in the distance. The space around them was eerily silent, the calm after the storm. The battle had ended, but the war wasn't over. The Z-Corps were still out there, and they would return. But for now, humanity had done what it came to do. They had defeated the enemy and saved the Xylians. "Status report," Ramirez said, his voice steady but filled with exhaustion. "Shields are down to 12%, Captain," Lieutenant Turner replied. "Weapons systems are offline and the engines are running at 40%. We're barely holding together, but we're functional." Ramirez nodded. "Good, keep me posted. We need to get back to the Xylian homeworld and make sure we're fully repaired before we do anything else." "We'll need to make repairs, but we can't stay here too long," Turner added. "The Z-Corps could regroup and launch another attack at any time." "I know," Ramirez said. "But we need to make sure the Xylians are safe first. They're our allies now." The Xylian fleet, though much smaller than the Z-Corps, had also suffered heavy losses. The once-proud ships of the Xylian fleet were now battered and broken, but they had fought valiantly. Queen Zareth's voice came through the communication system, calm but filled with gratitude. "Captain Ramirez," she said, "we owe you and your people a debt that can never be repaid. You have saved us from certain destruction, and for that we will be forever grateful." Ramirez looked up at the communication screen, meeting her gaze. "We did what any ally would do. You fought bravely. Earth is proud to have helped." There was a long pause on the line, and then Zareth spoke again, her voice tinged with something deeper. "You have done more than fight for us. You have given us hope, something we have not had for a long time. I would be honored to call you and your people true allies in the galaxy." "We are honored, Your Majesty," Ramirez said, nodding. As the communication ended, the crew of the Defender turned their attention to their immediate task, getting the ship back into working order. The damage was extensive, but they had survived the worst of it. They still had a long road ahead of them, but they had proven something that no one had expected. Humans weren't just survivors. They were warriors. The next few days were filled with non-stop work as both the humans and Xylians worked together to make repairs. The Defender was patched up enough to get back to the Xylian homeworld, where the real task of rebuilding could begin. But despite the long hours and hard work, there was a sense of camaraderie growing between the two species. The humans had fought beside the Xylians, and they had earned each other's trust. On the Xylian homeworld, the atmosphere was a mixture of relief and sorrow. The people had been saved, but the damage done to their planet was catastrophic. Cities had been destroyed, and entire regions had been rendered uninhabitable. It would take decades, maybe even centuries, for the Xylians to fully recover from the Z-Corps' invasion. But they were not giving up. Thanks to the humans, they had the chance to rebuild. Queen Zareth spent her days overseeing the recovery efforts, working closely with the humans to assess the damage and develop a plan for reconstruction. The Xylians, though devastated, were a resilient people. They had been through wars before, and they had always come out stronger. This time would be no different. Ramirez and his crew had done their part, but their mission was far from over. The Z-Corps were not the type to retreat for long. They would regroup, they would plan, and they would come back. And when they did, the humans and Xylians would be ready. Ramirez stood on the bridge of the Defender, looking out at the vast expanse of space. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. The Z-Corps would return, that was certain. The question now was whether humanity and the Xylians would be ready for the next round. "We need to be prepared," Ramirez said to his crew, his voice filled with determination. "We can't afford to let our guard down. The Z-Corps won't forget this. They'll be back, and when they are, we need to be ready." Turner nodded. "We'll be ready, Captain. We've proven what we can do together. We just need to keep our strength up and stay ahead of them." Ramirez nodded. He trusted his crew. They had shown incredible courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and they had won. They had proven that Earth was a force to be reckoned with. As the Defender made its way back to the Xylian homeworld, Ramirez knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The Z-Corps would return, and the humans and Xylians would have to fight again. But this time, they would be prepared. They would be stronger, and they would be united. Together, they would face whatever challenges the Z-Corps threw their way. The days that followed were filled with recovery efforts and tense moments as the humans and Xylians worked side by side. The Z-Corps had left behind a trail of destruction, but they had also left behind something else, a sense of unity between two very different species. The humans had fought for the Xylians, and the Xylians had fought for the humans. They had forged an alliance in the heat of battle, and now they would work together to rebuild and prepare for whatever came next. But not everyone was content to sit back and wait. On the far side of the galaxy, the Z-Corps leaders were already discussing their next move. The humans and Xylians had won this battle, but they had made a dangerous enemy. The Z-Corps would not rest until they had conquered the galaxy, and they had learned a valuable lesson from the defeat they had suffered. The next time they faced humanity, they would be prepared. For now, however, the humans and Xylians could take a breath. They had won, and they had each other. The war was far from over, but they were no longer alone. Together, they would stand against the Z-Corps, and together, they would protect their worlds from the invaders who sought to destroy them. Captain Ramirez stood once more at the helm of the Defender of Earth, looking out at the stars. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity had earned its place in the galaxy, and they would fight to keep it. The tension had not yet dissipated. While the humans and Xylians celebrated their victory, they knew deep down that this was only a temporary respite. The Z-Corps, though forced to retreat, would return. They were ruthless, and they had learned from their mistakes. The next encounter would be different. The Defender of Earth had bought them time, but that time was running out. Captain Ramirez stood in the quiet command room of the Defender, staring out at the stars through the viewport. His mind raced with plans and possibilities. The Xylians had been saved, but their world was devastated, and the Z-Corps would not leave them alone. Earth had shown its might, but this was only the beginning. The battle for the galaxy had just begun. Captain, Lieutenant Turner's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. The Xylian leadership wants to meet. They're asking about the next steps. Ramirez sighed and nodded, his hands resting on the console in front of him. Send them to the conference room. We need to talk. Minutes later, the Xylian leaders arrived, including Queen Zareth. Her appearance was as regal as ever, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the burden she carried. Her people had been saved, but the cost was high and the future was uncertain. She entered the room with a sense of quiet strength, her footsteps echoing through the metal hallways of the Defender. "Captain," Queen Zareth said as she took a seat at the table. "We have much to discuss." "We do," Ramirez agreed, taking a seat opposite her. "We've won this battle, but we both know it's far from over." "Yes," Zareth replied. "The Z-Corps will return, and when they do, they will come with more power, more destruction. We cannot wait for that day. We must prepare, and we must prepare now." The room fell into a heavy silence as the crew and Xylian leaders exchanged glances. Everyone knew the truth. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. "We've been thinking about this for days," Zareth continued. "Our people are willing to fight, but we cannot do it alone. We need your help to rebuild our fleet, to strengthen our defenses. You have technology we do not understand, but we can learn. Together, we can build a force strong enough to face the Z-Corps." Captain Ramirez nodded slowly. "We've already seen what the Z-Corps can do. They're not a threat we can take lightly. But I agree, we need to unite our forces if we're going to stand a chance. Earth's resources are at your disposal, Your Majesty. We'll work together to build something they won't be able to defeat." A sense of determination filled the room. For the first time in days, there was a sense of purpose. The humans and Xylians weren't just survivors. They were becoming allies, a united front against a common enemy. "Good," Zareth said, her voice filled with resolve. "Let us start at once." Over the next few days, the combined forces of Earth and the Xylians began the long process of rebuilding. The Defender and its fleet would be the first of many new ships to be built, combining the best of human and Xylian technology. Engineers worked side by side, learning from each other, sharing knowledge, and developing new systems. The humans brought their expertise in advanced materials, energy sources, and weaponry, while the Xylians contributed their deep knowledge of space travel and defense systems. The repairs to the Xylian homeworld were also underway. Though much of their planet had been destroyed, there was hope for recovery. Earth's engineers and Xylian architects worked together to rebuild cities, repair infrastructure, and restore what had been lost. The devastation was vast, but the spirit of both peoples was even stronger. They knew the Z-Corps would return, but they also knew they would be ready. As the days passed, the mood shifted. What had begun as a desperate alliance had transformed into something more. Humans and Xylians were no longer just allies, they were partners. And as they worked together to rebuild, they began to form a bond that went beyond strategy and military strength. They were two species, once strangers, now bound by a shared purpose and a shared future. Meanwhile, on the far side of the galaxy, the Z-Corps were far from defeated. Their fleet had been crippled, but it had not been destroyed. The Z-Corps leaders were furious. They had underestimated the humans, and they had paid the price for it. But they were not the type to give up easily. They would regroup. They would rebuild. And when they returned, they would be stronger than ever. Z-Corps emissaries met in their dark command centers, discussing their failures and making plans for the future. They would need more ships, more weapons, and more firepower. But they were patient. They knew the humans and Xylians would be vulnerable once they stopped rebuilding. It was only a matter of time before their enemies let their guard down. Back on the Xylian homeworld, the joint efforts to rebuild continued. Captain Ramirez had seen many things during his time in space, but nothing had prepared him for the unity he witnessed between the humans and Xylians. They were different, yes, different species with different cultures, histories, and ways of life. But in the face of a common enemy, they had come together, and it was that unity that gave him hope. The Defender was being repaired and upgraded, its systems enhanced with Xylian technology. It was stronger than ever before, and it was only the beginning. New ships were being built, and new alliances were being forged. The humans had brought their technology, and the Xylians had brought their knowledge of the stars. Together, they would be an unstoppable force. But even as the alliance grew stronger, Ramirez knew that the Z-Corps would be coming. They would be coming with all their might, and this time the humans and Xylians would have to be ready. The Z-Corps would not show mercy, and they would not hold back. But neither would they. The Defender of Earth would stand tall, and so would the Xylians. As the rebuilding efforts continued, Ramirez found himself at the center of a growing alliance. He had once thought of Earth as a solitary planet, isolated in the vastness of space. But now, with the Xylians by their side, the humans were no longer alone. The galaxy was vast, but humanity had found its place in it. They had found allies, and they had found strength in their unity. The battle for the Xylian homeworld had been won, but the real fight was still to come. The Z-Corps were out there, and they would not stop until they had destroyed everything in their path. But Ramirez was ready. The humans were ready, and the Xylians were ready. Together, they would stand against the Z-Corps, and together they would win. As Ramirez looked out at the stars once more, he felt a deep sense of resolve. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. The humans and Xylians would never back down. They would fight until the end, and they would fight together. "Prepare for the next phase," he said, his voice steady. "We've won this battle, but the war is far from over. We stand together or we fall alone. Let's make sure we stand." And so, with the alliance between humanity and the Xylians stronger than ever, they began their preparations for the next battle. The Z-Corps would return, but this time they would face a united front, a front that would not falter, a front that would not break. The war for the galaxy was just beginning, and the humans and Xylians would fight side by side until the very end.